oh, this is actually Japan. Like, this is real. This is happening. Such a unique market, and though you can build for it, it's extremely hard to enter. So there's some unique dynamics about Japan. The market is large enough, and there's enough opportunity where you can tackle Japan, cultural challenges, language challenges, logistics, regulations, all of those challenges. Something that is unique about Japan is that
Welcome to Unpacking Japan. I'm Toby, and today I'm sitting here with Skyler.
Hi.
Thank you very much for coming all the way from Tokyo.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure.
You work in venture capital at Incubate Fund.
Yes.
You've been there for a little while, doing a lot of research. And today we want to learn more about the venture capital kind of industry field here in Japan and the differences maybe with what happens outside of Japan. But before we get into that today, could you introduce yourself a little bit to our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Schyler Cole, originally from the U.S., Memphis, Tennessee, to be precise. The best barbecue in the world. I don't know if you knew that.
And whiskey, right?
And whiskey.
Tennessee whiskey.
There you go.
Oh, bourbon?
Whiskey,
I'm not sure.
Yeah,
whiskey.
Yeah, you got it. But yeah, born and raised in Memphis. Then went to Stanford for undergrad, studied economics, and passion of mine lies kind of at the intersection of health and behavioral economics. And for my undergraduate research, I did my own research looking into kind of food behaviors and personal health perceptions, particularly in the African American community, and looked at it across income levels. So at the time, I was really frustrated with a lot of the literature and all the conclusions, as well as the solutions that were proposed. So in some way, I wanted to do something about that. So I did some original research in Tennessee and in the Bay Area, got some interesting results, got some funding, and was able to start my own social enterprise, Health Through Heritage, which is really dedicated to creating a marketplace for more socially and culturally competent food and health resources. I founded it back in Memphis. So at the time, I was very excited to bring what I'd learned being in the Bay Area and kind of Silicon Valley and all of that and apply what I thought was this more fine-tuned cultural and social lens to building. So I was excited to do that. Loved the work I was doing, loved the impact I was able to have. But being back in Memphis made me really, helped to reassure in me and reinstill just how important financial, social, and human capital are. And because I was seeing so many interesting ideas and projects and businesses that had been founded or had grown since I'd left for college, basically. And I thought that if only they had the right capital, they could already start to tackle these problems that I was going home to face myself and provide solutions for myself. So that's when I decided to develop this kind of capital allocators toolkit. And for me, that involves both directly working with individuals, teams, businesses to support their businesses, multiply their impact, but also because I want to make sure that the next person, the next business that comes along doesn't have the same challenges faced in the present. I feel that a more systemic approach or systems-based approach is also necessary. So I decided to also look into capital allocation and entrepreneurship from a policy perspective.
The Bay Area where you studied and you did your research is, Silicon Valley, very famous for getting a lot of investments, a lot of fast-growing companies coming out of there.
Exactly.
And did you really notice a big difference with, for example, Memphis, where maybe people were struggling harder to get people to support them?
Yeah, absolutely.
What were the reasons for these kind of main differences?
Yeah, no, there are huge differences. And we'll talk about this later, but I think that Memphis and places like Memphis are very similar to Japan in that there is a lot of potential, but still not quite the level of resources available for entrepreneurs that you see in other innovation ecosystems. But I think that it may be surprising to hear that when I was at Stanford in the Bay Area, I never saw myself in startups, never saw myself in venture capital because I didn't like the culture that I saw surrounding it. Kind
of this two business, financial world.
That, and I think just the focus on being able to invest around certain types of people, certain problems. And of course, I think that, a lot of it's really exciting and there's a lot to learn, but I just saw it being so separate from a lot of the things I was really passionate about. But going back to Memphis made me realize, these are very useful tools and I can apply them to the areas and the people and the organizations I'm passionate about. Even in places that in the present day maybe aren't as developed, but have the opportunity to really grow uniquely.
So you go back to Memphis, you realize venture capital is not necessarily something that is economics, investment bankers and so on, but actually a tool that can help people. And you want to apply this to Memphis.
Yeah. And places like Memphis.
Places like Memphis.
Yeah.
So how did you go from Memphis to Tokyo?
Yeah, great question.
What was the click that made you want to go to Japan?
Yeah, so I'd actually had an interest in Japan since elementary school. I think Rochelle in her interview mentioned this, but there's the Memphis Botanic Garden would have these events on different cultures. And the elementary school that I went to was in walking distance, maybe about a 15-minute walk from my school. And so we take a lot of very little steps on field trips to go to the garden. And I just loved the events about Japan. And so I really planted a seed early on. I also have a really incredibly wonderful family friend who's Japanese. And through her, I've been able to experience the culture in different ways growing up. Kind of around high school, I discovered my love of economics in high school, but also started to look at Japan from an economic lens, kind of combine those interests. In college, I took a year of Japanese and was a part of a student group related to the Stanford Japan Exchange Conference, which brought students from our sister universities from Japan to Stanford to experience life as a student. But I realized towards the end of undergrad that I hadn't gone to Japan myself.
So a long time interest in Japan, but no yet direct connection.
Yeah, exactly. And so after graduating, this is a completely different conversation, but I had this epiphany while I was still in undergrad about agency and making choices for yourself and kind of what I would truly love to do versus what I did because I feared something else. It can dive into that in another conversation, but started to think that I want to be more intentional about these different passions that I felt across my life and at least give myself the chance to try and act on them in some way. So I graduated, started my social enterprise, and when I decided to pivot from the company, I decided, well, maybe this is a good time to go to Japan. And if I could go to Japan and start to build this capital allocators toolkit, that'd be ideal. So I applied for different programs, different fellowships, a lot of different roles to come to Japan. Ended up being accepted to the University of Tokyo, where I studied public policy and looked into public-private partnerships for supporting diverse SMEs and startups.
Oh, cool. So you kind of prepared this for a while. You were researching how you can get to Japan while doing something you like. So you didn't decide to, okay, I'm just going to drop everything. I'm going to, I don't know, maybe work on the JET program or come as a teacher. You wanted to pursue your kind of mission in Japan.
That was really important for me.
So what was it like when you first arrived and settled in Tokyo and you're suddenly like such a long interest in the country and finally here?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that a lot of the elements and the imagery that I really enjoyed growing up, I would see it in glimpses or just be surrounded by and like, oh, this is actually Japan. Like, this is real. This is happening. So that was a really incredible moment. And I love going out to the countryside. So seeing a lot of that imagery was just really a major moment for me.
Just taking it all in.
Yeah, just taking it all in for sure.
And you did your research at Tokyo University, graduated.
Yes.
And then started working immediately in venture capital?
So actually, kind of between the time I pivoted from my company and through grad school, I worked for a couple startups and for basically the family office of a serial entrepreneur based in the US. So I had about a year of experience in venture capital before starting my role here in not here in Tokyo, but in Tokyo.
And now we mentioned venture capital a little bit.
Yes.
And you said earlier it's a tool, but for someone who's maybe not so familiar with the term, what exactly is venture capital? Absolutely.
And I think just at any point, if I use an abbreviation or something, please stop me because I don't like using so much jargon. So please stop me if I ever abbreviate something. But yes, venture capital, VC, is a form of private equity financing, which means that the companies that you invest in initially are private companies. They're not on, they're not public. They're not on a stock exchange. And the targets of this investment are companies that either are expected or have shown exponential growth potential.
So usually startups?
Usually, yes. Typically startups, while startups at least start under the umbrella of SMEs. There's definitely a distinction between building a startup versus building an SME. They're both very important, very necessary, but with different goals and trajectories.
Does it happen also that a company that's maybe advanced and has been running for quite a few years is somewhat established in its industry but wants to suddenly expand, looks for venture capital investment? Or will this be done usually through, for example, IPO, so IPO, initial public offering?
So it depends on a few things. So when looking at what is a venture backable company, so a company that a venture capitalist or a venture capital firm will invest in, involves a few things. One, like I mentioned, the high growth or exponential growth potential. So, I mean, 2x growth is great, but X squared growth is more of what we're talking about. We're also looking for scalability. So with a certain number of resources or a certain level of performance, you're able to maintain that while also meeting greater demand. So that's basically a simple way to describe scalability, but also an important component is defensibility. So while you may have an incredible, Apple Tart company, let's say, there are probably a lot of other Apple Tart companies that are doing pretty well. But what makes a startup unique is that you're doing something that someone isn't able to easily copy.
Like a unique proprietary distribution system.
Yes, exactly, like that.
Okay. So if the company has something unique and they want to expand and grow, possibly they look for venture capital investment.
Yeah, so to answer your question more directly, I think if they check those boxes, yes, but venture capital is just one strategy. It doesn't fit every company. So you can have an incredible company, a profitable company, an impactful company, but still not be eligible for venture capital. I think, and there's different approaches to incorporating this type of financing. Some entrepreneurs will look for it earlier in the lifespan of the company, or a little bit later, like you said, if they're looking to grow. But if you don't necessarily check off those boxes, then maybe other forms of financing would be a better fit.
So who's behind these investments? Is it typically, I'm imagining kind of Shark Tank investors, Mark Cuban just has a lot of money in his bank account, sees a company that has potential, is going to be like, I'm going to back this company and see what happens. Or is it more kind of a group of investors that are then being managed by the venture capital fund who will kind of do all the work basically?
Yeah, so while there are high net worth individuals, those with lots of disposable income to invest, those are typically called angel investors who will invest in startups. The basic structure for a venture capital firm is a set of either, one or more general partners who choose the investments and support the companies in their portfolio. But where does the money come from? The money comes from a group of either individuals or entities known as limited partners. And those are the people that invest in the general partners who then invest in the startups.
So it's like a chain of investment links.
It's a chain of investments, yes.
Okay, so if we have if this will be our definition now of venture capital, and we apply to the Japanese context, is there anything that's different in Japan to what we just basically described?
So the basic structure isn't different. Something that is unique about Japan is that it's still a very nascent startup and venture capital ecosystem. So compared to places like the US and cities like Silicon Valley, Boston, New York, which are, really the initial but also most developed ecosystems in this way. And of course, in other countries as well, they're very developed innovation ecosystems. Japan is still in its earliest stages. There has been a lot of growth in the past 5 years, and moving forward, I think there's a lot of opportunity and unique opportunities for Japan. But the biggest difference is probably the maturity of the ecosystem right now.
Where does this come from? Why is this ecosystem in Japan further behind, considering that the economic boom here was really basically after World War II, from the 50s all the way to the 90s?
Yeah.
So the company has a lot of capital. Until recently was the third largest economy.
Until recently, yes, you're right.
Now there would have been opportunities, right, for a lot of startups, for a lot of investment into younger companies.
Yeah.
Why is this Why didn't it happen here the way it happened in the United States?
Well, there are a few factors, and not all of them are necessarily Japan specific, but venture capital as an industry, even though it's been around since the 70s and even some origins maybe a little before then, venture capital as an asset class really has developed in the past 20 or so years, even in places like Silicon Valley. So from the late 90s, the boom through the 2000s and onward, the venture capital firms in kind of the form that we know now have really grown and really set the stage and set the standard for what venture capital firms are. So that's not necessarily to say that Japan has been behind it. That's just as an industry, it's really developed initially coming from the US. I think Japan, and when looking at, I guess, startups and venture capital, it's not just about the development of the asset class. What's really also involved is a mindset and a culture towards risk and return, because venture capital is a high risk and potentially very high return industry,
and probably no return in many cases.
In many cases, no return. So being able to adopt that mindset, adopt that risk tolerance, as well as build an infrastructure to invest in that way, is something that is, a lot of geographers are figuring out how to make work for themselves and have made work for themselves. In Japan in the past, the venture capital firm that I'm working for right now was founded in 2010. And around then, other firms started to emerge. And we were talking about this before, that at that time it was a very different landscape and very much harder to raise. But in the past 5 years, Japan has slowly started to adopt more practices and set goals for itself moving forward. So hopefully there will be some more changes and greater adoption, and Japan reaches more of its potential. Because while there is venture capital here, relatively, it's less than what you would expect from other advanced nations, as well as relative to Japan's GDP, or gross domestic product.
So if we look at the ecosystem right now in Japan in terms of like startups and what's coming out of the country, what does the landscape look like a little bit? What type of startups are emerging here? And maybe is there something unique that comes frequently in Japan?
Yeah, so I think there are interesting startups across industries, from software as a service or SaaS to deep tech and frontier tech. So when I say frontier tech, very cutting edge technologies, as well as in healthcare and kind of precision health. I think that in Japan, more than other places, there is a more significant question of whether to go global or a company's relationship to being global. And that has an effect on, or I guess that makes certain industries, at least initially, more interesting than others, at least from my perspective, as someone who is, of course, a foreigner, but also really hoping to promote better inter and intra relationships in the startup ecosystem. And so when we think about kind of frontier tech, deep tech, those are pretty exciting because those are companies that are inherently able to go global a little easier than a software as a service or a SaaS company.
There's a huge kind of barrier and a lot of discussions going on about a lot of systems that emerge in Japan and whether or not they should be designed and used only within Japan, or if this is something that will be exported. And I feel like there's a lot of hesitancy maybe from Japanese starters and founders to go overseas, maybe because of the language barrier, cultural barrier, or perhaps because of the additional level of complexity of an international company that you then need to manage, right?
Yeah, but actually, while I'm definitely pro, at least have a global mindset, and whether or not you're tackling a global or domestic market, something that is amazing about the startup ecosystem in Japan is that with the right problem and right business model, the market is large enough and there's enough opportunity where you can tackle Japan, and as an entrepreneur, as a business, you can reach a certain level of scale and have an exit, like you mentioned earlier, an IPO or initial public offering, and as a team be pretty well off. Have a nice, condo in a nice part of town, and that's incredible, and that's something that's really not present in the same ways in a lot of other geography. So that's something very special about Japan, but it also makes it hard when we're thinking about these more domestic teams to decide to go global. Because I think there are challenges both that you have to think about very early on as you continue to grow. I think one is having a mindset, not just to have the aspiration to go global, but really start to understand what does that mean as we're building a team and as we're building our infrastructure and building our technology. And then as you start to grow, like you mentioned, there are challenges. There may be cultural challenges, language challenges, logistics, regulations, all of those challenges. Conversely, for companies that are wanting to come into Japan, because it's such a unique market and though you can build for it, it's extremely hard to enter. So there's some unique dynamics about Japan.
I want to get back a little bit about this cultural point. You mentioned the high risk aversion that is typical of many Japanese investors. So how is this then, how do venture capital firms in Japan manage this? Is there a different way to approach risk management than you are familiar with in the United States, where it's quite common to take big risks for big rewards?
Yeah, so definitely the risk challenge is very different. I will say, though, that the methods for assessing risk and opportunity are very similar. So I invest at the early stage at what's known as a pre-seed or seed stage. Typically, a company hasn't taken on any institutional investment. So from a firm, maybe they have investment from an individual or a grant, but haven't gone to another venture capital and successfully raised funding. So at that stage, there's really not so much to examine, but we look at the team's unique insights, the skills. Are they a fit for the problem they're trying to solve? We look at their ability to execute. How strongly do we have conviction in them being able to do something, even if it's not exactly what they're telling us today? We look at the market, which isn't necessarily just about the size of the market, which you want to be able to, as a company, be able to take advantage of a certain size of market and capture a certain size of market. But in addition to the market, it's more about kind of the dynamics and what makes this an opportune market to tackle today. And then we look at the product vision. And I say product vision specifically because at the very early stages, you will likely change what you're doing in the next 6 months or 12 months. So it's really more important. What are your goals? What is the problem you're trying to solve? And how are you committed to creating a solution to tackle this problem? So those are things that we'll look at here in Japan, but also globally at the early stage. So the process
of evaluating a company is exactly the same?
Yes, I would say it's pretty similar.
Is the risk threshold different then? Where in the United States, if a company checks a certain number of boxes, you'd be like, okay, let's go and invest in this. Yeah. But in Japan, there may be a couple of additional boxes in terms of maybe the market and how risky it is, or the product and so on.
Yes, I think overall there's a difference, and by firms will have their own strategies and own ways of making decisions, which isn't unlike venture capital firms other places. So that's not so different, but definitely the overall risk tolerance. And in addition to venture capital firms, what's different and what helps startups and teams to overcome these challenges in other geographies is the availability of either angel investments or being able to get some early type of funding, either from, if you have the privilege of raising from your family or from friends. But while there is definitely an angel network here, it's not developed to the same extent as other places. So without that, it can be a little hard. I feel a lot of companies feel stuck between starting off and kind of what most firms require, and we call it traction. So what progress have you made? What signs that you're going to be a success? What signs that you're going to delight customers? It's like, well, I need funding to do what I need to do that. But firms may say, oh, well, talk to us when you've done this thing to show traction. So it's kind of
like a proof of concept.
Yeah, it definitely could be in the form of a proof of concept. So I definitely see entrepreneurs who fall into this gap more often here. And I really understand those frustrations.
You mentioned angel investors as well, and there being a network.
Yes.
It's certainly, I feel, maybe less mediatized than overseas.
Yes, exactly.
The one name that comes to mind quite regularly is CEO of SoftBank, right? Masayoshi Son, who is probably the most prominent of the angel investors.
Yeah.
But I also feel, and this may just be my impression, he doesn't always come into the news for the right reasons, right? The biggest investment, one of the biggest he made, WeWork, just filed for bankruptcy a couple of weeks before we record this interview.
Right.
And there's a lot of questions about why did the investors not kind of push for change in the company model, business model, and so on and so forth before it reached bankruptcy. Do you think there's a sort of a different approach or a different way for angel investors to manage their assets than in the United States?
I think that a difference in the angel network here is, and this is maybe a representative problem of other aspects of the ecosystem, the knowledge sharing isn't quite as fluid, dynamic as other geographies. So while there are angels or high net worth individuals who maybe would like to invest or are investing, the channels to engage aren't quite as clear. And I think it's also not quite as clear for entrepreneurs. That being said, oftentimes, and this is something that can be both really beneficial, but also I can understand being really unfair, is that sometimes it's just a feeling. People don't necessarily invest on anything very rational.
Sometimes it's not the data, it's just a gut feeling.
Yeah, and that's an important component. Historically, a lot of that social capital has gone to certain profiles. And one of my goals is to help better distribute the social capital so that more investors will have the instinct to believe instead of the instinct to kind of turn down different profiles or interested in getting capital. But it is a reality that you're just sometimes investing on a feeling, or I believe in you. And even though that decision to believe in someone doesn't cost anything, it's invaluable how impactful it is.
For you now as a venture capitalist in Japan, what is a typical day like? Yeah. Do you have a typical day?
So not really. I think that's one of the things I enjoy about Japan, about venture capital, is that I of course have regular meetings and this and that. The days can vary quite a bit. So maybe some days I'm meeting with entrepreneurs, or I'm meeting potential limited partners, or looking into a certain space, or having a deep research or work day. So it can really range, which I love.
So there's a lot of components to the job.
Yes, there are a lot of components, and you can also, as you develop your expertise, decide how much time you spend on different aspects.
Is Japanese language something that you need in your daily life for work?
Yes. So the internal language is Japanese, even though my team were able to use English. But overall, Japanese is the main language. This is maybe a hot take, but I do think that, and we've seen this in other geographies, that English is the language of startups. And I think to have a more globally dynamic and exciting ecosystem, we need to use more English. But yeah, so using Japanese, and that's still definitely, I would say, a major component of doing work here.
So for anyone who would be interested in getting into that field, having a certain level of Japanese to be able to communicate with colleagues and read documents is required.
Yes, I would say so, overall.
When you talk about your work with people that are maybe not from the field, whether it's friends, family, or people like me today, do you often encounter certain misconceptions about what a venture capitalist does?
Most definitely. And it's very understandable, because the industry is very opaque, and opaque by design. And I hope to provide more transparency, so I'm happy to always answer questions and break things down and just make things as clear as possible. I think one of the misconceptions, and I think you kind of alluded to it in a way, is like thinking about Shark Tank, these like really intense, like cutthroat kind of environments. But behind the investment decisions, behind the processes, are human beings just like us. And I think if you can start to understand that and think about that, even when you're just thinking about the industry or trying to engage, that helps a lot. Because while venture capitalists, claim to have strong conviction and have all these things, we are not infallible, and we are prone to mistakes, and that's human. So I think a lot of times it can be very intimidating, I think, to enter the space, but really they're humans at the end of the day.
Would you say then that when potential startups or people looking for investments are coming to you, you also sometimes provide guidance? So for example, their project is not strong enough, or as you said, they were asking to get money first to show you what they can do instead of showing that they can do something and asking for money.
Yeah.
But that you will then basically guide them and be, okay, if you want to get to this point, you can try this and this and this. So kind of a business advisor.
Yeah, I do that all the time. That's what I love to do. I love to work one-on-one with, or, with entrepreneurs or with a team to figure things out, refine ideas, work things through, work on pitch decks, work on presentations, figure out potential strategies, like all of that. I love that. So please reach out if you want some assistance. Happy to help.
Do you more often have foreign entrepreneurs that are in Japan or Japanese entrepreneurs that come to look for funding?
Yeah, so it's a mixture. I definitely want to provide as much help to the foreign community as possible, just because the current dynamics and resources just make it extremely challenging for the group. But I do Japanese or English founders or I don't even want to kind of delineate it by nationality, but it's just kind of more aspirations, whether it's a more domestic focus or globally focused or global mentality, but really try and be helpful across the board.
Is there anything you personally look for in a startup, or when someone comes to pitch you something or some idea where you have a tendency to be interested in this field or this type of startup?
Yeah, so I do have some areas of interest, some industries that I'm particularly excited about. I like to call it the agency economy, which involves basically providing services and tools for both individuals and small businesses to have better physical, mental, emotional, or temporal agency over their lives and actions. That can range to anything from, as an individual, health and wellness related tools to, as a business, providing better tools for commerce and as commerce evolves. So it really is a range, but that's kind of the theme that I'm particularly excited about.
Kind of what you brought also from your research at Stanford and from what you were doing also back in Memphis when you started your own thing, and now you try to apply this here.
Yeah.
Do you feel like this is lacking here? I mean, mental health is quite of a big issue in Japan, and
it's a huge issue.
There's a lot of, there's the famous word that makes the headline sometimes, karoshi, death by overwork.
Exactly.
Are there more and more initiatives done by startups in this field to kind of provide solutions?
Yeah, so there's definitely an increasing awareness and attempt to create solutions. One of my team's portfolio companies is in the space. And I think in addition to creating solutions, there's more dialogue and more language being used to describe these problems. Because I think in English and in kind of the US, there's a different, still definitely has a ways to go as well. A different dialogue around mental health and seeking mental health services that I see in Japan. Additionally, more resources, more dialogue. Still a long way to go, but definitely more solutions in the space.
But it's interesting because that's a field where, because maybe I'm not part of it, it's difficult to imagine, for example, the profitability. You were talking about you're looking for a company that has the possibility for X square kind of growth. The field for social help, social support is something one may have a tendency to think as this should be accessible by everyone and should not be something that maybe costs too much money so people can benefit from it.
Yeah.
So how does this then turn into a high growth startup?
Great question. So at my very core and all the things I do, I am seeking to show that you can do well and do good. So do well as a business, do good in society or impact. And at the end of the day, if you're creating a business in the space, it still has to be a solid business model, which unfortunately we see business models that succeed, that scale, that grow, that are actually can be very predatory on some of the human inputs or humans that engage. But I don't think that has to be true. And I think an important consideration when building these solutions is that the user may not be the person paying for the service.
Could be a government, could be the company paying for a service.
Yeah, exactly. So you're not necessarily always charging the person who you think you'd like to support directly, there's business models that can help provide for that and make it not that out of reach for those you'd most like to target.
Yeah, we did have a few months ago Anna on the podcast who has a startup in Kyoto, kind of providing or gathering like an AI-based data gathering company to help especially women.
Yes.
And it's quite interesting and quite challenging. She also had to go through these funding seeds. So if, let's say, I have an idea for a startup now, and so I work and develop my ideas for a few months, I create a business model. Is that then enough for me to come to you and ask for an investment, or do I need to actually have clients? Do I need to operate the company, have some kind of a cash flow?
So I'll break this down into a few different key points. While you definitely need to show, well, actually, let me take a step back. There's a component when being assessed by a firm that is directly related to your business, but at such an early stage, we're investing in people, and a part of being a people-oriented business is building relationships. So I would say, as you start to have an idea or you start to build relationships with venture capitalists. I say it's never too early to start, because while an exciting idea may get you through the door, having built trust and developed that social capital ahead of time will better prepare you for when you actually have a specific ask. So that's probably my biggest advice to founders. If they're considering building something or considering seeking venture capital, start building those relationships early on, networking. And it's not just about, maybe the partner that you'd like to work with directly. It's about everyone in the firm, treating everyone with respect. It's about having an overall good reputation with other partners, other firms, other stakeholders, because all of that can only benefit your case and your journey. To talk a little more concretely about what the requirements are business-wise, it depends on the firm, but for companies, at my current firm, I'll break down our kind of investment not strategy, but kind of breakdown of the types of companies we invest in. About 30% we actually invest in interesting founder without an idea, and together with a general partner, they work on the idea and eventually come to a point, maybe in a year or so, that it's ready for potential investment. Another 30% in a founder with an interesting idea, go on a similar journey. And then the last 30% are for existing companies that we don't do this kind of incubation with. And for those companies, like I mentioned, we need to see some form of traction. And that could look like a lot of different things. It could look like, if it's revenue, that's great. It doesn't have to be. It could be number of users on the platform. It could be a variety of things. So it depends on what's most relevant for your business model and what is a strong signal moving forward. So definitely assessing your business model and what would be most relevant is important. And if the kind of at the pre-seed, you don't necessarily have your MVP, but you're looking to build it. But even if it's something that's maybe a little rickety or maybe not fully fleshed out, being able to show that you can put something together is really important. Because at the early stages, it can be hard to attract the right technical talent. So if you can show that, at least until you can find someone who can really build this out, you can build something in the interim. If you are not the more technical person, that's also really important.
So ideally then, if I want to be a founder or if I want to start something, the best is just network, meet venture capitalists, talk to them about the idea as well, and then just see where it goes from there without necessarily kind of being locked up in my room trying to put something together and then just knock on a door with something that might not actually fit anywhere. Exactly.
And I understand that process of sharing about your ideas can be very difficult. And
you might be worried that it's stolen.
Exactly. So venture capitalists aren't in the business of stealing ideas. We do look at a range of companies, even in one particular field, to understand the business models, deepen our knowledge so we can better support. But I think if that is a concern, and it should be a concern, you definitely don't want to dole out your trust lightly. build relationships outside of your exact idea. And then when you feel comfortable with someone, start to share. And which isn't unlike maybe finding a strong mentor or sharing your ideas about something else. But I would recommend that, especially if you're feeling unsure about sharing your ideas.
I want to talk a little bit more about networking in Japan.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned this is a number one advice you'd give and top priority. Networking in Japan can be difficult and very different.
Yes, it can.
My experience here attending Japanese events and foreign events. Foreign events is typically what you would see in Europe, where I'm from, or maybe the US.
Exactly.
Meet and greet, have a drink, quick chat, exchange business cards.
Yeah.
And maybe you make a connection, maybe you don't.
Right.
You connect on LinkedIn and you just continue the conversation if something clicks.
Exactly.
In Japan, it's very formal. I feel like it's a very maybe distant relation at first. Exchange of business cards, very formal exchange.
Yeah.
And it can take a very long time before you actually get through to someone enough to maybe do something together or discuss an idea together. What have you experienced the same here, or is this a struggle for young founders in Japan?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. And while I do go back and forth between the more international ecosystem and domestic ecosystem, I also run a startup community that's really focused on having this more global mindset and for international founders. And it's kind of a poor proxy to say that we're globally minded, but really the idea is to not designate by nationalities. We're like, if this resonates with you, come. But we do host a lot of events and really try and facilitate these events that are actually productive and bring in people that have decades of experience, engaging in these more traditional systems and structures, because it is really difficult. It takes a lot of time. And at this point, that's still very much a reality. And for companies building in Japan and those that want to come to Japan, it can be really hard once you're here to build that trust. And if you do build that trust, to outlast the time it requires to come to a point where, like you said, you can actually move forward with the projort together with the company.
Because during that time, you need to at least pay yourself a salary.
You do, exactly. Right. You need to eat. The bills need to be paid. So that's a challenge, and that's something that I'm working to figure out a more clear and direct solutions, because we've seen success cases with companies that are able to build relationships with kind of the representatives of Japanese companies outside of Japan. And then because you've already built, kind of had that person to validate you, when they talk to the home office, there's already that trust created. So those are instances where I don't say it's not as difficult, because that's also very difficult, but are at least able to come to a point where the startup and large enterprise can work together. But definitely hope to continue to make those paths clear, and hopefully a little shorter at some point.
There are a few communities here in Osaka as well, the Startup Guild, organizing events regularly, kind of trying to bring together founders with interesting meetups and topics to provide information.
Yes.
Because access to information can also be difficult, right?
Very difficult. A lot of it's siloed.
Legislation, also maybe typical business practices. If you can't necessarily just find everything online. So there are some communities like the one you're building in Tokyo, like Startup Guild as well. What do you feel when you interact with people on those events and you see young founders are the most common challenges they're facing, the common questions that they come to you with, and like, I can't figure this out. Do you know how to do it?
Yeah. So one challenge that I hear a lot, and we hear a lot in our community are trying to build solutions for, is because information is so siloed, you can collect quite a bit of information about maybe just starting out, even if you do have to search in different places. But as you continue to take steps in building your business, the information available becomes even more sparse. And what we're hearing is that it'd be great to have some playbooks or blueprints so that this journey doesn't have to feel so just uncertain. Like
going through the fog in the early morning on winter.
Exactly. It's like, where am I going? Maybe I'm about to trip over a branch, or you never know. So that's one of the biggest challenges. That and being able to find that first partner in Japan, whether you're building here or coming from somewhere else, those are two of the biggest challenges I hear.
Venture capital is a very private enterprise. So from a private perspective, you're helping to support startup founders. But the government plays a role too.
It does.
What are some of the policies here in Japan regarding startups? Are there any initiatives from the government to facilitate founders to get started, to launch their projects?
Yeah, so on a national level, that there have been initiatives and funds that are being dedicated to startups, to certain industries, to university spin-outs, which is very exciting that more capital is being directed. There's definitely concern about exactly how that capital will be allocated, because it still needs to allocate it with a certain level of expertise and understanding.
It needs to be managed, right? You can't just throw 1 billion yen at the wall and hope that it flourishes X square.
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
You need someone to manage it.
Exactly. So while that's really exciting, and we see that, at the national level, but also in we see it at a regional level as well. These funds and different institutions providing or set to provide this capital. You also see, particularly when it comes to international founders, changes in kind of startup visas or like business visas. That's starting to change. Still not a perfect solution, but you see governments nationally and regionally that are trying to push for support for startups. I do think it's very exciting, but I do think they still fall a bit short of targeting some of the most dire problems and just realities of both wanting to have a successful company, but also be a human being living in Japan. So hopefully you continue to have conversations about this with different stakeholders, and hopefully there'll be more feedback loops into what will be even increasingly helpful.
So maybe if I understand this correctly, the government as well from their side are struggling to get access to this siloed information perhaps, and are not able to assess the problems and challenges from founders correctly. And so what they're doing is providing a lot of funds to make change happen, but without knowing what change should actually happen.
Right, exactly.
With a few founders that I've exchanged here, one of the big things I notice is there don't seem to be any sort of safety net.
Yes.
It's very scary for venture capital to invest millions in a company and maybe lose it, but at the same time it's also very scary for someone to say, I'm going to maybe leave my job and start something without knowing if I can have a revenue, without knowing if I can have a stable visa,
right?
Which is a big question, especially for foreign founders. You mentioned the startup visa or business management visa, which from what I've seen, and maybe I'm mistaken, can be a bit tricky to acquire. You need to generate a profit, but if you generate a profit, that means you already need to have an established company for which you technically need the visa you already applied for. And then also to start the company, you need to have a bank account, but for the bank account, you need an address. So the loops are not necessarily done in the right order.
Exactly. So that is a huge reality. And I do work with Shibuya. I'm an ambassador for Shibuya Startup Support, and I think they're always looking to help founders and refine, but that is a reality. And I think it's hard not having the perspective of, these are all the potential challenges. But I think in addition to like those logistic challenges, having only a year, that's very short. That's really short. That's almost barely enough time to get your bearings and then to try and build a company. So there's change happening around that, but like all those things make it, like you said, hard to have really there's no safety net. I think that also plays into both in the requirements as well as this lack of understanding of the necessity for a safety net is really understanding what startups are. They are risky, and startups you can still call them that as they continue to grow, but for the purpose of this conversation, I'm focusing on the very early stages. There's not a lot a lot to show, and they don't meet the same requirements or meet the same characteristics as a small business. And I think stakeholders need to better understand that and be willing to accept those characteristics, because it's great to say, oh, we want startups, but you have to understand what a startup really is and be willing to support that.
You make me think now about the definition of a startup.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
What exactly is it now? If we really have to try to put it down, is it a small company, but you just mentioned it's slightly different? What defines a startup?
So I would say a startup is similar. It's not so similar. It's not so dissimilar from the expectations of a venture capital firm. It's a company that has a potential for exponential growth. I think that's key. But it's like what stages are a startup? What does that actually mean? What does the business look like? I think you really need additional language, and we do have language for that about what stage. But I would say, yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to define without being more particular on the stage itself.
So if we are maybe struggling with the context and the stage in English,
yeah,
is this vocabulary available in Japanese as well?
Yeah.
Because startup is a foreign concept that is being brought to Japan.
Yeah.
How do Japanese companies, investors, government talk about startups?
Yeah, so I think it's a huge challenge, and this is something that I've heard from community members. It's that there's a difference in what's considered a startup by, let's say, a more international crowd versus what some of the established players consider to be a startup. And I would say that for established entities in Japan, it means a company that has slightly more growth or progression than what we would consider just a very early stage, scrappy, low resource, doing the most with the least, and doesn't typically have all the securities of what we consider more established businesses to have, and a track record of what businesses should have. We consider other businesses to have.
Looking back, now you said that venture capitals really started becoming a thing in Japan from 2010-ish. This is when it kind of grew and expanded.
Yeah.
What kind of positive change have you seen in the last few years where maybe some things have gotten easier, some things have gotten faster or smoother than they used to?
Yeah. So we have seen a lot of positive change just in the past 5 years. We've seen a growth in the number of firms. We've seen growth in the types of firms, both in stage and industry. So more firms in deep tech, for example. We have a high concentration of firms that invest in the early stage, pre-seed, seed stage, and a few firms now that invest a little bit later. There's still a need for more firms to invest at the growth stage, but that's been a huge change over the past few years. And there is increasing information in English as well, more understanding of what different structures in Japan, what they look like, and how you can compare them to maybe other structures, other financing systems in other countries. So that's all started to grow, and I think there's increasing adoption of best practices and engagement from other geographies, even though we still have a ways to go. But it's been a drastic change just in the past 5 years, let alone what it looked like maybe 10 or 15 years ago.
Has COVID played a big role in this kind of change to make maybe Japanese companies and Japanese government realize, okay, we need maybe younger generation of founders. We need to have a younger generation of companies to also tackle today's challenges?
Well, I don't know if COVID so much motivated that mentality, but what's interesting about the pandemic is that while there was more fluctuations during that time in other geographies, Japan was able to stay relatively constant and relatively stable. So the market didn't have to fluctuate as much. So that's really promising both for the domestic market, but also those who are interested in Japan, the stability. Of course, part of that's because Japan is a bit more isolated, but that allowed Japan to continue growing and progressing in a way that didn't have to adjust or adapt so much to these fluctuations.
Interesting. I want to change the topic a little bit, and I want to ask you now personally, you're investing into different fields, although you have your preference and your company does as well. But technology is changing very fast.
Yeah.
How do you keep up to date with everything and to have a good understanding of what the industry is this specific startup is trying to get into?
Yeah. Right. So again, it can feel overwhelming because there's so much information in some industries that's changing day by day, or it can change day by day. But one reason why venture capital resonates with me is because I do love to look across different industries, different markets, and see what's happening, and really in the areas that I specialize in, dig deep. So you won't know everything about everything, but staying up to date with reading, whether that be newsletters, longer research pieces, podcasts. I'm a huge podcast person. And just staying in contact with people and exchanging information either through regular meetings or conferences or what have you. All those methods, just constantly consuming information.
Does that sometimes make you realize perhaps that someone pitches you an idea for one industry, but that kind of idea, that model will actually be most suited for another person that pitched something else? Does this happen frequently?
It does. And so that's actually the role of venture capitalist is when it comes to working with an entrepreneur, the entrepreneur's role is to know whatever they're doing better than anyone else. And so as a venture capitalist, I need to understand the market, but my goal is to also look at everything else that's happening while the entrepreneur and the team is heads down, so that I can provide the information and say, oh, this business model has these relevant portions, or you may want to adopt this. So that's part of my value add, is to be able to share that information. And then as a venture capitalist, just for myself and figuring out how to better invest in companies, looking across markets, being able to make comparisons and refine my own ideas and be able to gain or collect the information that will allow me to reach conviction is follows being able to look across these different markets in different industries and seeing what works.
In Japan, I see quite a few challenges that are quite typical to Japan, but are starting to happen elsewhere.
Yes.
Aging population.
Huge opportunity.
A lot of emptying houses.
Yes.
Are a lot of startups trying to find innovative solutions to this, which could potentially be exported to countries that are starting to see the same problems?
Yes, that's a huge opportunity. These demographic shifts, and that just folks having a company that is adapting and providing solutions for these demographic shifts can be a really strong point of conviction for certain investors. But in Japan in particular, like you mentioned, Japan is facing a lot of challenges 10, 15 years before other countries, or maybe they're experiencing it, but not to the same extent as Japan. So really, if you can build a solution that targets those trends and shifts now, that puts you in a great position to be able to provide the solution to other geographies. And companies are definitely starting to tackle that, but I think there's still a lot that can be done in the space.
All in all, in Japan, we talked a bit about the political side of things. We talked about the investment side of things and the challenges for founders. In your experience here, what do you think is required for like a thriving ecosystem of startups and investments in Japan?
Yes. So a huge theme of what I believe in and what makes me passionate about building a startup ecosystem is that it really is a combination of financial, social, and human capital. And within those categories, really breaking down all the components of that. So let's just take human capital, for example. In a startup ecosystem, you need a certain level of talent density. So employees are potential talent that have a certain set of skills. When we look at financial capital, it's the presence of angels, it's the presence of investors, and not just investors at the early stage, but across the stages from early to growth, and then having opportunities for liquidity events. It's in social capital, having a culture and a mindset that is expansive and not exclusive. That there's a culture of making connections and sharing information, and just across categories, having the resources and the infrastructure to facilitate all these interactions with various stakeholders. So it's a combination of the types of stakeholders, the willingness for these stakeholders to engage, the methods by which they engage, and the opportunities in different industries, and to be able to kind of combine these things and provide solutions. So there's all these different layers, and it requires not just investors, not just entrepreneurs, but policy, like we mentioned, like support systems, like we mentioned, academia. There's all these interconnected pieces that make up a startup ecosystem.
Does academia play a big role in this as well, like the universities and such?
Yeah, universities play a huge role. And it's an opportunity for Japan as well, because there are so many incredible universities and so many strong research institutions and labs. And there's a big opportunity for the research from those labs to go and commercialize. And a lot of it is kind of in this deep tech space, which, like I mentioned earlier, is more prime for kind of being globally competitive. But huge. I think it's a source of educating talent. It's a source of potential companies and just technology and innovation itself. Because I went to Stanford, and Stanford played a huge role in the development of Silicon Valley, and just having all these different types of really engaged, smart people there. So universities play a huge role, across geographies and innovation.
What you said is interesting about the requirement for the thriving ecosystem, because when I asked you earlier what is required for a young founder, or not young, a founder to get started, is you said the biggest advice I'd give is network, make connections. And what you said is required just for the thriving network is just networking. Different entities need to relate more, connect more, and exchange more.
Exactly.
But I feel like this is also what's holding everything back in Japan, because everything is so locked into places.
You got it. This is my problem. Yes.
So in your professional assessment, what would you say, or which is the area where something could be or should be unlocked to kind of get the ball rolling, so to say?
Yeah. So I definitely think and overall about Japan, I'm very optimistic, but I'm also realistic. But a point to be optimistic about is that while all these pieces aren't necessarily optimized and engaging how we'd like them to be, all the pieces are there, which is unlike some geographies where maybe there's not sufficient capital, or maybe there is social unrest. But Japan really benefits from having all these pieces. It's really an exercise in putting them together. So that should give us hope. That being said, I think the first thing we can do, and what I'm trying to do, is really connect existing resources and connect existing information and making that more publicly available. Because if you don't know something exists, you don't realize that's an opportunity. And that's one reason why I'm happy to be on this podcast for so many reasons and having this conversation. But if we don't tell our stories, if we don't share this information, not just about venture capital, but other aspects of living and making a life in Japan, other people won't know it's possible. So I think that's true when we talk about it in different arenas, whether it's in Japan, and maybe a young Japanese high schooler doesn't even know that startups are a thing. They may not, even though it may be something that be excited to do, if they don't have that information, they can't act on it. So really, I think it's about collecting and making information more transparent. That's the first step.
Sharing information, disseminating information. Well, I hope that with this podcast, we can do it at least a little bit.
Most definitely.
Yeah. What is next for you now in the next few years in the field of venture capital? What is something you'd like to do in Tokyo, in Osaka, in Japan? Something that a startup you'd like to see come up? Or
So for me, my guiding star is to invest in and support diverse ideas, people, and organizations, building real tools for real people, and particularly the agency economy, like I mentioned. And in the next few years, I would like to, my goal is to be able to continue to refine my ability to do that, both in Japan as well as in other geographies. So I feel very strongly about not just building within an ecosystem, but bridging and connecting ecosystems so that we can continue to share information, share best practices, and really elevate these ideas and these businesses that can have an amazing impact on an individual and societal level. So for me, that continues. That means continuing my work in Japan, but also continuing to connect and work in other geographies as well.
If any founder or maybe young high schooler interested in starting a company is listening to this, where would you say they can find and get interesting information right now? If they're looking to understand more of this, where should they go? What should they type on Google? Yeah,
so actually you should go into Google and type venture deals. It's a book. It's probably one of the best, if not the best, unbiased books to read about venture capital and startups. I think the tagline is "Be smarter than your lawyer," but that was
that's a good advice.
It is. That's one of the first books I read about the space when I wasn't even interested. And a professor and a mentor, dear mentor of mine, taught a class and had this book be a requirement. But I think that gives you a great understanding of venture capital from a venture capitalist perspective, because I think as an entrepreneur, it can be hard to think about the perspective of an investor. But I think that book gives you a great overview of a lot of different dynamics. So
Venture deals.
Yes, venture deals. Get it on Amazon, Kindle, what have you. So I think that's a great way to start. And something that's incredible both about startups and venture capital is that so many backgrounds are beneficial and can be beneficial in the space. So even if you think that, I don't know if I'm a fit, your unique perspective, your unique tools, your unique talent can contribute to either career building or career in venture capital. So what's most important is kind of refining what you believe in and what you want to do. And if you want to apply that to startups, do it, or venture capital.
So don't doubt yourself that you may not fit, but find a way where whatever you can do or your perspective can contribute.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, that's some advice and first reading for listeners out there.
Well, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, of course.
We covered a lot of topics so far. Do you feel there's something we didn't approach, something we didn't talk about, whether it's your work as a venture capitalist, whether it's about venture capital in Japan in general, or maybe a founder's perspective, something you'd like to share?
Yeah, so I think just in closing, I've talked about some of the dynamics and talked about kind of a bit of this tension between the international and domestic perspectives in Japan. I think there's a fine balance between taking the best practices globally as well as staying true to the beautiful things, to the unique capabilities of a place. And moving forward, I do want Japan to change in a lot of ways, but I do also want it to retain the things that make it unique. That's how I feel about Japan. That's how I feel about Memphis. That's how I feel about other geographies. So while I think it's important to be productively critical and realistic, stay optimistic and continue to, really see the value in different perspectives, different walks of life, different culture, to innovating for the sake of making this place better for everyone included. So I think just with that's a driver for me in my career as a venture capitalist, as a capital allocator, as a builder, and that's a closing note I'd love to share with everyone.
Thank you, Skyler.
Yeah.
We'll put links to whatever you'd like so people can find you and maybe get in touch if they have more questions, or they can ask them to us and we can forward them to you.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
Thank you for sharing so much about your work here and what venture capital is and how it's different in Japan. It was very insightful for me, and I hope it was also for our listeners.
It's such a pleasure talking.
Thank you for coming all the way from Tokyo. Yeah. Thank you to our listeners today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again next week. This was Unpacking Japan. Bye.